From August 1961 to May 1962, the renowned American psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a series of controversial experiments in the field of social psychology. Their sole purpose was to demonstrate how obediently subjects could follow the instructions of an authoritarian, even if these instructions contradicted their own moral principles in whole or in part. For one of these experiments, Milgram assembled a group of 40 people. Each person pressed a button on a special device and, they believed, delivered an electric shock to another person each time they lied when answering questions on a questionnaire. This person, who could be called an actor, played the role of the victim and pretended to be in real pain. During the experiment, most participants continued to increase the voltage to the maximum, simply because they were being urged to do so by an expert at that time. As a result of this experiment, Milgram concluded that by following the orders, the subjects had shirked responsibility for what had happened. It was believed that by following clear instructions, they literally transformed themselves into objects and perceived themselves as tools in the hands of another person. And while the case I'm going to tell you about today seems to be a perfect example of such behavior, it also showed how some people in similar situations would pass off their own impulses as blind obedience to another person. On Tuesday, October 26, 1965, a 15-year-old teenager who called himself Richard Hobbs called the Indianapolis police while speaking to a police officer. He reported a girl named Sylvia Likens and an incident that had occurred at 3850 East New York Street. Unfortunately, Hobbs couldn't explain why she had died, but he claimed he tried everything he could to revive her. According to available information, a fairly large family with the surname Banaszewski lived in the house in question. It consisted of a 36-year-old woman named Gertrude and her 7 children. 17-year-old Paula, 15-year-old Stephanie, 12-year-old John, 11-year-old Marie, 10-year-old Shirley, 8-year-old James, and 18-month-old Dennis. 2 biological sisters also lived in the house, 15-year-old Jennifer and 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. Shortly after entering the house, officers found Sylvia Likens lying on a mattress in the basement, showing no signs of life. The police were immediately shocked by her condition. She had large, fresh bruises, severe injuries, bruises on her head, split lips, broken legs, and several large cigarette burns. One of the burns on Sylvia's stomach formed the number 3. Next to this burn was an inscription, apparently made with a sharp instrument. This inscription read, "I am a prostitute and proud of it. All members of the Banaszewski family, as well as the victim's sister, Jennifer Likens, and Richard Hobbs, the teenager who had made the phone call, were the first to be interviewed. They all gave the same version of events. Sylvia Likens had apparently lived in this house with her sister since June 1965. At that time, her own parents were working at fairs and traveling throughout the state. According to Gertrude's testimony, Sylvia had gone out with a group of men the previous evening, and the next morning she found her lying on the doorstep. At that point, she was almost naked and already had numerous injuries. The woman testified that she brought Sylvia into the house as soon as she saw her. Although she was semi-conscious, she was reportedly able to write a note describing what had happened to her. Gertrude specified that she lost consciousness and died shortly thereafter. As far as I know, the text in this note was addressed to Sylvia's parents and reads something like this: "I went for a walk with a group of boys. They said they would pay me if I did them favors. I got into their car, and they got what they wanted. When it was all over, they beat me and left numerous wounds on my body. They also wrote on my stomach that I was a prostitute. I did everything I could to annoy Gertrude. Not only did I cause her problems, but I also forced her to spend much more money on me than she had. I also broke a new mattress and urinated on it. Gertrude also had to pay several medical bills she couldn't afford, and I made her children nervous." Although absolutely all family members confirmed this version, Sylvia's sister, Jennifer, eventually went to one of the police officers and begged him to take her away. In doing so, she confessed what had really happened, and thus accused Gertrude, her older children, and several neighborhood boys of abusing her sister for months. Eventually, everyone was arrested and taken to the police. Sometime later, Sylvia's body was autopsied. Her condition shocked even the most experienced experts. In fact, over 100 different injuries were found on her body, including wounds, bruises, cuts, broken bones, and cigarette burns. Given all these circumstances, the experts concluded that Sylvia had died of a cerebral hemorrhage caused by a severe blow to the head, about an hour before her body was discovered by the police. Sometime later, in December 1965, Gertrude, along with her two daughters, 17-year-old Paula and 15-year-old Stephanie, and her 12-year-old son John, were officially charged. Ultimately, this story caused a great stir in the public and was described by the media as the most shocking case of its time. Thanks to the testimony of all those involved, as well as neighbors and several other witnesses, the police were able to determine exactly what had happened to Sylvia. Before I tell you about it, however, I should first explain how the Likens sisters came to live in this house. According to some sources, Sylvia and her sister Jennifer were the daughters of Lester and Betty Likens. As I mentioned earlier, they worked at fairs and traveled around the state. As a child, Sylvia's sister Jennifer contracted polio, which caused one of her legs to stop developing. For this reason, she was always dependent on help and usually stayed close to Sylvia. In early 1965, an argument arose between Lester and Betty, after which the woman left the house with her daughters. Shortly afterward, she was arrested and briefly imprisoned. Eventually, Sylvia and Jennifer were left alone. After some time, a mutual friend introduced them to a 17-year-old girl named Paula Banisowski, who invited them to live with her. By this time, her family's house was already known in the neighborhood for being home to a large number of children and teenagers. Many of them had nothing to do with Gertrude and only came there because she allowed them to smoke and drink alcohol. Although the woman initially welcomed the sisters reluctantly, she eventually relented. Sometime later, the girls' father learned that they were staying with Gertrude and visited them to check that everything was all right. In a conversation with Lester, the woman said she could continue to look after them if she received $20 a week. The first few days of their life together passed without incident, but then everything changed fundamentally. The trigger was Lester's delay in making the promised payment. Finally, Gertrude lost her temper and took out her anger on the sisters. Subsequently, she punished them quite frequently under various pretexts. She was particularly annoyed by Sylvia. She was accused of not taking enough care of her personal hygiene and of leading a dissolute lifestyle. Of course, there was no evidence that this was actually the case. Nevertheless, the physical violence against her continued to increase. In August 1965, Raymond and Phyllis Vermillion and their children moved to the same neighborhood where the Banisowski family lived. Shortly thereafter, Phyllis began looking for a nanny for her children and learned about her neighbor, who had a reputation for having taken in several teenagers. She even visited her to get to know her better. By this time, the Banisowski family's financial situation was worse than ever. The situation in Gertrude's house escalated slowly but steadily. The children living there received little more than some bread and thin soup. Even the food had to be shared because there weren't enough plates or cups. The rooms were dirty, the smell stale and unpleasant. In this environment, one girl in particular caught Phyllis's attention. Scrawny, with a reserved look and a bruise on her face, Gertrude briefly explained that this was Sylvia, who was always causing trouble. On her way out, Phyllis observed one of Gertrude's daughters, Paula, approach Sylvia and pour a cup of hot water over her head. For Phyllis, this was the moment she decided to no longer expose her own children to this environment. Sylvia, on the other hand, had no way to escape. Over time, The situation worsened dramatically for her. Not only Gertrude, but also her children, especially Stephanie and John, began to participate in the punishments. From October 1965 onwards, everything took on a new dimension. Sylvia was increasingly accused of inappropriate behavior. Gertrude became convinced that Sylvia was spreading rumors about Paula and Stephanie. She began to increasingly target her. Disciplinary measures? On particularly sensitive areas of the body. Gertrude also reported these accusations to her daughter's boyfriend, a teenager named Coy Hubbard. After learning of this, he too physically assaulted Sylvia. At the same time, Gertrude claimed that Sylvia had made negative comments about other boys in the neighborhood, and eventually even invited them into her home. Some of them, encouraged by Gertrude's insinuations, behaved hostilely toward Sylvia. Gertrude herself repeatedly inflicted pain on the girl by stubbing out lit cigarettes on her skin. Other teenagers also imitated this behavior. By this time, Sylvia was already severely physically weakened. She had numerous visible injuries, no longer attended school, and was frequently excluded from meals. One day, she left the house to collect empty bottles and buy something to eat. When she returned with a few coins, she was immediately accused of stealing. In the presence of several teenagers, she was forced to undress. A degrading and traumatic scene ensued, the details of which were later discussed in court. Just a few days later, another incident occurred. Sylvia accidentally soiled her mattress, possibly as a result of the constant physical strain. Gertrude and her older children took this as an excuse to place her in the basement of the house. Before being taken downstairs, she was forced to remove her clothes again. She was denied access to the toilet. Whenever she said she was hungry, she was humiliated and mocked. What makes the case particularly shocking is the role of the many people present. Numerous children and young people witnessed what was happening to Sylvia. Some told their parents, but no one reacted seriously. On October 15, a nurse arrived at the house. She recognized that a young girl with severe injuries lived there. Gertrude explained that her name was Sylvia Likens, that she lived erratically and repeatedly put herself in danger. She also claimed that Sylvia was behaving inappropriately in the neighborhood. The nurse left the house without taking further action. Another regular visitor was Richard Hobbs, a 15-year-old acquaintance of the family. There were indications of a strange closeness between him and Gertrude. One day she asked him for help in punishing Sylvia. Together with Paula, John, Shirley, Stephanie, and Coy, they tied up the girl. Further abuse followed. Finally, a heated needle was used to burn a disturbing inscription into her stomach, one of the most gruesome traces of this case. According to everyone present, immediately after this hazing, the girl was taken to the basement, where Stephanie's boyfriend again assaulted her. Only later did Sylvia's sister, Jennifer, tell the police that she seemed weaker that evening than ever before. The next day, Gertrude began to worry about the girl's condition. Apparently, she knew she could get into trouble if anything happened to the girl. For this reason, she literally forced her to write the letter to her parents, telling them that she had allegedly been abused by the boy she was with. After a while, Sylvia tried to escape for the first time, but she was so weak that Gertrude easily subdued her. The woman then tried to feed the girl donuts, but she couldn't swallow them. This finally enraged Gertrude, and she again raised her hand against Sylvia. Later, on Monday, October 25, the girl was again subjected to abuse by the woman, her children, and other young people. That evening, Coy Hubbard and Stephanie Banaszewski pushed her down the stairs, leaving the girl unconscious for several hours. According to the coroner, it was very likely that this very fall caused a cerebral hemorrhage, which, in addition to her weakened state, was fatal. On Tuesday, October 26, when Stephanie and Richard Hobbs attempted to bathe Sylvia to bring her back to consciousness, they suddenly discovered that she was no longer breathing. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude personally instructed Hobbs to call the police. Apparently, The woman hoped that the note she had them write would vindicate her in the eyes of the police. However, when they entered the house, Jennifer told one of them what had happened to her sister, even though she herself had been threatened with violence. As I mentioned earlier, in addition to Gertrude Banaszewski, her older daughters Paula and Stephanie, her son John Banaszewski, as well as Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard, were the first to be arrested. The police also arrested other minors who had also been involved in the abuse. Overall, what had happened in the Banaszewski family home shocked the entire country. Almost everyone who followed the developments in the case found it incredible that such a large group of teenagers could be involved in such a gruesome crime and show not the slightest sympathy or shame for their actions. Moreover, they all in one way or another blamed the victim herself. Richard Hobbs, for example, who had decided to cooperate with investigators from the beginning, was convinced he had done the right thing, believing that Sylvia had insulted his mother. As for John, Stephanie, and the young man Coy Hubbard, like Richard Hobbs, they showed no particular sympathy for Sylvia. Paula Banaszewski was pregnant at the time of her arrest and was therefore more concerned about her well-being and the health of her child than about the upcoming trial. Gertrude Banaszewski initially claimed that her older children and their friends had killed Sylvia. Ultimately, however, she admitted to being directly involved in the torture and declared herself insane. It is also important to note that Gertrude was born Gertrude Nadine Van Fossen on September 19, 1929 in Indiana. She was the third child of her parents, who had a total of 6 children. Although almost nothing is known about Gertrude's childhood, it is certain that she had a difficult relationship with her mother. At the age of 11, she witnessed the sudden death of her father, who suffered a cardiac arrest. This event obviously left a lasting impression on her. She also had a good relationship with him, while continuing to live with her mother had a rather negative effect on her. Rumor has it that Gertrude's mother was an extremely strict and cruel woman who constantly accused her of leading a dissolute lifestyle. When Gertrude was 16, she dropped out of school for good and married a man 2 years her senior, named John Banaszewski, and although the couple had 4 children, they could hardly be called a happy family. In reality, John was a rather rude and violent man who not only insulted Gertrude but also physically abused her. After about 10 years of living together, they finally decided to divorce. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude met a man named Edward Guthrie and remarried. Their official relationship, however, did not last long, and in 1963, Gertrude reconciled with her first husband. After some time, they had 2 more children, but their new marriage was not a happy one either. In 1964, 35-year-old Gertrude began a new affair with a 23-year-old man named Dennis Wright and gave birth to her 7th child. However, as it later turned out, Wright was much more interested in the child support payments Gertrude received, and therefore soon disappeared from her life. Throughout the trial, the woman's lawyers deliberately emphasized how difficult her life had been. According to their testimony, Gertrude suffered from severe mental disorders and other health problems and was so tormented that she could not comprehend what was going on in her home. However, these arguments could not keep her out of prison. Ultimately, Gertrude Banaszewski was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Paula Banaszewski was also found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Despite her pregnancy, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also found guilty and sentenced to 21 years in prison. However, as far as I know, Hobbs died of lung cancer about 4 years after the verdict. Another defendant in the case, John Banaszewski, was also found guilty but for involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 21 years in prison. His sister, Stephanie Banaszewski, was ultimately sentenced to only 1 year for aiding and abetting. Although various experts described Gertrude throughout this time as a cruel and unstable woman with sadistic tendencies, she behaved completely normally in prison. According to the information available, the Commission for Early Release described her in 1985 as a good, healthy, and well-adjusted woman who had done everything she could to atone for her guilt before society. Taking all these circumstances into account, she was released from prison about 2 decades after her incarceration. Despite several public organizations collecting approximately 50,000 signatures to prevent this, after her release in early December 1985, the woman publicly accepted full responsibility for her actions and expressed her sincere remorse. Gertrude Banaszewski died of lung cancer on June 16, 1990, at the age of 60. Aside from all the horrific details that made this case particularly gruesome, many were also disturbed by the fact that such a large group of young people would so easily agree to commit such heinous and monstrous acts against another human being. Of course, in Gertrude's own case, it was quite possible that her mental state had influenced her brutal behavior. She apparently suffered from severe depression, and her failed romantic relationships only worsened her situation. She may have even envied Sylvia, because she was a young and beautiful girl. Eventually, Gertrude began to treat her the way her own mother had once treated her, and the note she wrote on her stomach was a kind of confirmation of this jealousy. Thanks for watching, and take care of yourselves.